And welcome back to World Talks, where every word matters here on TVP World. My name's Don Arleth. And joining us now to shed some more light on the matter of the situation of the civilian population of Warsaw during the uprising is independent historian Alina Nowobilska, who has just completed a series of podcasts on YouTube, I believe.
On every platform.
On every platform about the Warsaw Uprising. So if you're interested, go ahead and look for that. Well, thank you for joining us today here on World Talks.
Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me. I'm excited to be able to talk about something we don't talk about much.
Yeah, well, it's that time of year, the 1st of August, where at 5 p.m. today everything will come to a standstill. It's quite an interesting sight to experience if you're not from Poland and you experience it for the first time. But let's start off with talking about some of the ins and outs of the Warsaw Uprising. And really, what strikes me the most is just not only the resilience of the Polish people and the plight, what they suffered during those 63 days, but the civilian population. It seems to me that there was kind of a few stages of the Warsaw Uprising. Let's start at the beginning. How did the civilians adapt when the Home Army decided to go ahead and launch the Warsaw Uprising at 5 p.m. on August 1st, 1944?
Well, let's put this into a slightly modern context. At 5 o'clock our time, that's rush hour, and it was rush hour just back then. People, especially civilians and even insurgents who didn't know exactly the time of the uprising, got caught up in this rush hour. People were going to the dentist. So Michał Czartoryski, a very well-known priest, he gets caught. He was on his way to the dentist and he can't reach his unit, for example. Or a father and his niece end up being caught out and separated from the family because parts of the city are being completely cut off at this stage. So you can't move from, example, Śródmieście, so the centre of the town, to necessarily Mokotów because it's been completely cut off. And these people are having to survive. Children have been separated from their families. But on the other hand, you've got people who are so euphoric. We've got to remember, we hadn't had independence for 5 years. You know, it's the brutal occupation and people have been arrested, deported, murdered, everything left, right and centre. And now there's that moment where we can hang out flags. It's so incredible that you'll be able to pull out the Polish flag. No more is this horrible swastika. No more do we have pictures of Hitler. We can tear those down. We can tear down the pictures of Himmler and whoever else they've got pictures of. Get rid of those. Put them on the barricades. Get the Germans to shoot it. Instead, we're going to put up the Polish flag. And it's very interesting because Tadeusz Burkomorowski also reminisces that he got called up by his soldiers to say, look at the skyline of Warsaw. We've got flags everywhere, and that's that moment of patriotism, especially for the civilians too. But soon that moment of euphoria, how long did that last? Was that a matter of days, of weeks? It really depends on the district that you're in. Again, we're going to go into I'm going to try and avoid these sort of details, but I think the hardest districts at this point are hit are Wola and the Old Town, of course. And we know that the Old Town is heavily shelled, heavily bombed. The Germans want to take it. The civilians there are under such incredible pressure, under not just bombings, but for example, they're being hit by heavy weaponry like the Nebelwerfer, which is phosphorus-filled shells that are exploding. Some fantastic, what are they called? Forgotten what the word is now. In Polish, it's plakaty, posters, very incredible posters that hide in the gates because this is dangerous. It's all to do with the propaganda. Civilians are terrified at this point. On the other hand, you've got things that are happening in Wola, which is a whole different kettle of fish, where civilians are being targeted. I mean, civilians are already being targeted on the second day, where they're being put in front of tanks, being used as shields. But in Wola, you have units that are coming in, that are murdering civilians, pulling them out of their homes, and literally shooting them, mass shooting them. I mean, a lot of people may or may not know the story of Wanda Lurie. It's one of the stories I always use. She was a young woman. She had 3 children. She was pregnant, and the Germans shot her anyway. They shot her children, but she survived. I cannot imagine being in that position of pure terror, especially for the civilians involved. This last 3 days, the major of the shootings, and the statistics between 40 to 70,000 people get shot within 3 days. And we're not talking about mass gassings, we're not talking about war in itself, we're talking about the destruction of the civilian population all because of one order given on the 1st of August by Himmler that says we have to destroy every man, woman, and child. And to this day, I still cannot comprehend how a child is responsible for the uprising.
Yeah, it's absolutely unfathomable, actually. So during this the Vola massacre, if you will, I mean, what did it look like? The Germans were taking civilians out of their place of residence, out of their tenement buildings, emptying building by building and executing the people on the streets.
And burning building by building as well. They were... I'm going to backtrack just a touch because we need to have a very brief conversation about who these people were that were doing this. This is Derlewanger, who is probably one of the biggest sadists I've ever come across in any of my research that I've ever done. He has a group of men, predominantly Germans, who come in there and basically murder, rape and loot. I literally just worked with a translation by a Belgian soldier who witnessed all of this. And if you would like to listen more, head to the podcast. I'm not going to reveal this on live television because they are so gruesome, so beyond comprehension, these testimonies of especially what these women went through. Rape was rampant through Vola. It was absolutely horrific. But coming back to the other civilians, they would, at the beginning, they started doing it slowly by slowly where they would murder people in their apartments. It's not useful enough, it's not going fast enough for them. And we've got to remember this is the thing that the Germans tend to do, is they tend to start with one thing, oh, it doesn't work, let's try something better, let's improve the way we're going to do this. So then what they thought of, let's just pull everybody out of the building, we'll take them to various different spots around Vola, and then we'll just mass murder them. So for example, one was in one of the factories in Wola, Wolska factory. And these people would be taken in 3s, 5s, and just shot and just thrown upon this pile. And Wanda Laurier remembers this moment because she survived this. She was laying there for about 3 days. And in those 3 days, she heard singing, dancing, music, drinking, shooting, as in anybody who moved, they shot them. She heard looting, so anybody had a watch or a ring or anything of those sorts. The looting was rampant. And laying amongst those bodies, for example, for me, is truly horrifying, that moment. She manages to get under from out of the bodies and she manages to get to safety in the end. But many of those people didn't. And many of those bodies were burnt and many of those bodies completely disappeared. Whole families disappeared, brothers, sisters, mothers, fathers, elderly. And we don't talk about this. We don't talk about what happened to these civilians. We talk about what happened out on the streets. We talk about and I do this, I'm very culpable of doing this. My grandfather took part in the uprising. So for me, I want to talk about his bravery. But we don't talk about the fear. We don't talk about that moment where somebody faces a gun in their face and that's it, everything is gone.
The Germans, there are claims that the Germans did this to try and break the spirit of the fighters, to stop the fighting. What type of effect did it have on the home army and the insurgents that were fighting against the Nazis?
Not everybody knew what was happening. There were rumors. There's a really good testimony of a decision of, let's say, I'll use the example I used before, using civilians as shields in front of tanks and heavy armor. When the insurgents faced this, it became a very difficult decision. Now, if we put ourselves in that situation, think about it. You and I are sitting here with weapons, we're being attacked by various different heavy weaponry, and there's a bunch of women, children and elderly standing in front of them. Are you going to shoot? They face this difficult decision, do I shoot or not? If I don't shoot, we're going to die. If we do shoot, we're murdering our own people. And I would not have wanted to be in that position to make that specific choice. And many insurgents had to make that choice. And I'm not going to sit here and judge them for the decisions that they made, because we ourselves, we cannot sit here and understand that moment in time.
We unfortunately, due to time, we need to fast forward a little bit towards the end and the final moments. So tell me a little bit about the situation, what it looked like when the city was completely razed to the ground and the civilian population was forced to leave.
The civilian population was being forced to leave way before that anyway. So they'd been slowly being taken out from the 7th of August. Pruszków was opened up, Dulag 121, and they were slowly being evacuated because von den Bach, the commander, wanted to be, let's say, quote, humanitarian. We can laugh at that now because he wasn't. He knew what was going on. People were being evacuated all through, and then especially in the last days, they were also given options toward the end of the uprising. You can leave the city. You have that option. The Germans did a ceasefire. You can leave. You have the option. Some people didn't want to leave, and then the rest were forced out to leave. And that was probably a very poignant moment for everybody. They distinctly remember, especially the capitulation. So I spoke to a very young, well, she was very young at the time. She was about 7 years old, and she remembers how the insurgents were leaving, and it was a very emotional moment that it's over, we've lost, that's it, it's the end. And she herself ended up leaving as well. She went through Pruszków, and she ended up in fortunately, she ended up in a city instead of in a concentration camp or forced labour camp. And she said, leaving my home, all you did was see burning buildings and the destruction of Warsaw. And she cried as she left. I think I would have too.
Yeah, it's something that it's just absolutely amazing to try and dig up the history, to look at the facts. It's absolutely unfathomable, especially for us here in the 21st century. Alina Nowobilska, I believe we've only scratched the surface. I wish we had more time. I would recommend to our audience to go ahead and look for Alina's independent work on YouTube and many other platforms to learn more about the Warsaw Uprising. Alina, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And that concludes this edition of World Talks. Thanks for joining us, and stay with us for more here on TVP World.